All right.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and I'm really happy to be here and to open the second day. So I hope you all enjoy it. And today we will be having, again, many interesting talks. And I'm also grateful for this opportunity to start the second day. And as Hendrik said, I will be presenting our project on self-other distinction in borderline personality disorder. And what I will be covering. It's not happening anything here.
Maybe we just need to click it once so that it starts to the books. Okay, fine.
Yeah. So my talk will be covering several aspects. First, I will be talking why we should consider self-other distinction in BPD. Then I will present preliminary results of our ongoing study on self-other distinction in BPD, and this is a large cross-cultural collaboration. Then I will be talking briefly about our new developed questionnaire, and then I will end with the outlook moving towards a victim science mindset, so that we should adopt a victim science mindset when we want to investigate clinical aspects or clinical and social aspects. So this will be then my talk today about, and to define, it was funny because yesterday we had World Cafe and we said like, how shall we define these all concepts? And then there is not one single definition. And here it's the same as well. So for this talk, we define in self-other distinction as an ability which helps us to differentiate what I feel, know, desire from that of others. And this is relevant for higher order social cognitive processes such as theory of mind or empathy. So, for example, when I see someone in pain and I know that this pain is only belonging to the other, then the chances that I will help this person are higher. But if I confuse their pain with being my pain, then I rather will be distressed and try to self-protect. So you can imagine it's quite important to know exactly what I know, feel, and desire from that of, and whether it aligns with the others or not. But now let's take a step back and think about when self-other distinction, or when we don't need the distinction, when we are the merge with others. And this is an example of automatic imitation, which is also present in children, or already present in children. And it's important to imitate others for them so that they challenge the boundaries between self and other. So they try to learn by imitating where their self ends and the other begins. And also when we are older, also during our social interactions, it's important that we have this ability to imitate. Because it has been already shown that automatic imitation increases chances of social liking, of prosocial behavior, and overall facilitates social interactions. Of course, we don't need to imitate any person we meet. Therefore, here we have developed the ability to control such imitative tendencies. And for this presentation, I will refer to this simply as motor self-other distinction or automatic imitation inhibition mechanism. So it's also important, like now you think about it, I'm walking, making many steps, but you don't do it because you know the situation doesn't demand this, and therefore you have this ability to control your imitative tendencies. Now let's move to the cognitive domain. As you can see here, I hope you can read the words, but there is an elephant. There are many people standing in front of the elephant, but crucial here is that their eyes are covered. And by taking their visual perspectives, which is not there, I can understand why they are making wrong assumptions. So some of them says it is a spear, it is a fan, it is a rope. So it's an example of self-other distinction in the cognitive domain, when I can say, I know why they are making wrong decisions, and I know that our visual perspectives differ. So I can see the elephant and they not. Visual perspective taking is a crucial ability which we all have, but to a certain extent. So some of us are better in it, some of us not so good. And in some clinical populations, this ability is challenging or is not even present. And I will talk briefly about what's relevant for borderline personality disorder. And Pavla, who is talking after me, she will talk about this disorder with more details. But briefly, it is that borderline personality disorder is characterized through the unstable self-image and also is associated with impaired social abilities. What is also important there that BPD patients are very impulsive and they also experience a chronic feelings of emptiness. They have fear of abandonment and also try to through attending to the others try. Okay. They have a big good. BPD disorder is also characterized or is associated with a high prevalence of childhood trauma. So many BPD patients report of having instances of physical or emotional abuse during their childhood. It is also genetically, there is a genetic component. And what's also relevant here that many of those who seek help in clinical settings, they have BPD diagnosis. So you can say that it's really an important population to investigate. And what is also important there is that even though there are treatments, there is still chronic social functioning might remain. And now I will briefly go through a model which Celine published, and we also saw it yesterday, so I will not go into details here, but I think it's really a great visualization of how self and other distinction can function. Thank you. Oh, I like it. So on one hand, the intact self as a distinction, you can see it here, so we can represent both perspective self and other, we can co-represent them, and this would be an intact self as a distinction. And then we can amplify those perspectives which is relevant for us during a specific situation. And then we can attend to the other, to the self, we can switch, and therefore we can co-control, co-regulate our emotions, and also it can facilitate a social learning. What happens in the BPD, on one hand, they're rigidly focused on themselves when trying to understand the others, and this we call here an egocentric bias. So they self-project their experience or their self onto others, but it can also go into another direction. They are too focused on the others when trying to understand self, and this is termed heterocentric bias. It's not that we are not biased, or those without the diagnosis are not biased. Of course, this can happen in everyday life as well, but here you can see systematically that there is this rigid focus on either of the perspective, and the flexibility in switching is impaired. But there is still not enough research on this, and therefore there is some evidence, for example, that they struggle to inhibit automatic imitative tendencies, that they also have difficulties to take another person's perspective, but the evidence is mixed and more research is needed. And this is what we wanted to do. So we started, for us, is a large collaboration with researchers from different universities and countries. So Germany, Czech Republic, Belgium, US, Austria. And you can see here, you probably will recognize many names. And this is, of course, an illustrable way to conduct science. And this I will also address a bit later. Our design, we used only two tasks, one from the motor and one from the cognitive domain. Of course, you can ask, what about the emotional domain? It's also very relevant, but for our first study, we wanted to take this to address these two domains. We also had a control task because we want to control, of course, if there is an overall impairment in reaction times, in accuracy, independently of the task. And our goal was to collect at least 100 BPD patients and 100 healthy controls. And you might imagine how hard it can be. Therefore, as I said, it is only for us possible through such collaboration. And I will briefly go through the task and explain them. Many of you know them, some of you not. So these are reaction time paradigms. This is an automatic imitation inhibition task measuring self-other distinction in the motor domain. A participant is sitting in front of the computer and sees a hand on a black screen, and they also see a square. They are told to react only to the color of the square, and they should ignore the hand on the screen. The participants are told it doesn't matter what the hand is doing, just react to the color of the square. So this is another frame. You see that the square changed its color to the orange, and participants should lift their middle finger, as you see here. But what is important here is that the hand is lifting another finger. And for us, we call it an incongruent trial. And what we expect here, and what we usually observe, that participants that are slower in the incongruent trials, when their movement and the movement of another hand do not correspond, as compared to the congruent trial, when the hand and the participants are lifting the same finger. So it's a very easy task, but you can imagine that so many trials and they need to do it fast. We systematically observe in other studies that there is the reaction times are slow and more errors, and by calculating the difference between incongruent and congruent, we can calculate the automatic imitation index. Now, a similar idea is in another task which has been developed earlier than the other version, and Dana is here. This task has been developed here in Belgium, and many of you know it. So the participants are presented with a cue, and they are first prompted with the perspective they have to take. So, for example, in this case, they would need to take the perspective of another person, she, and if it would be their perspective, then it would be the word you. And they also see a number. And this number, they need to verify whether the person in the room sees two dots. As you can see, it's very easy. You can say, yes, of course, she can see two dots. But what is important here, that you, as an observer, you can see three dots. And therefore, you have to inhibit your visual perspective and answer what she can see. So to visualize it again, here's a congruent trial where you and the woman see the same number of dots. It should be easy. And this is another incongruent trial where you and the avatar see a different number of dots. And what is good with the stats that we can quantify the bias in both directions. So we can measure an egocentric tendency. It's when we ask to participants indicate how many dots she can see, and therefore they need to inhibit their visual perspective. Or we can measure an heterocentric bias when we ask them to verify how many dots they can see and inhibiting the perspective of the avatar. So this is good that it goes in both directions. And yeah. And now I want to also talk about our hypotheses. So we have two hypotheses, which are the main one, that self-other distinction is impaired in BPD compared to healthy controls. And we also expect that the severity of BPD symptoms would moderate the effect. Of course, when I presented the BPD diagnosis, I also told you that BPD is associated with childhood trauma, with stress, maybe also with pain. And we have many covariates which we would like to include in our analysis. And for this, we also have predictions. But as you can imagine, there is a lot of going on, and many questions can be then exploratively addressed. And now to our results. So we are still collecting data. Now we have 128 BPD patients, so more than we expected, but we have not excluded anyone yet. We probably will. Then we also have 72 healthy controls, so we are a bit behind with healthy controls, and now this data collection is in the final stage. Our samples are rather young, 30 years, the majority are women, and also we match them with regards of years of education. And then because we have so many different samples, you can ask, how can we be sure that we can pull them together? And this is, of course, a question which we will address during the data analysis. But for now, we can say that our pooled data sets shows the characteristics which usually are found in the literature. So, for example, the BPD sample significantly has more pain than healthy controls, momentary pain, self-reported. They also have more momentary stress. Their BSL score is higher, and they also show higher scores in level of personality functioning in self and interpersonal domains. So this fits already, this sample characteristic fits to that what we know from the literature. Now I present the results of our tasks. So first we wanted to look whether the distribution of the scores is similar to that across all clinical units. And as you can see here, this is just a distribution in the BPD sample. We see that some units have maybe a bit higher scores, or that there are some outliers, but overall we could say the distribution are similar. And what we also saw that the BPD are making in this finger lifting task, they are making more errors than healthy controls. But this is independently of the condition, meaning it doesn't matter whether it's a congruent or incongruent trial, they're making more errors. Now I will lead you through this result. So we wanted to calculate the difference between incongruent and congruent trials. You can do it in at least three different ways. So you can check only the reaction times. And here we see a trend, the group differ, but not significantly. You can check only the accuracy, so only related how many errors they did. You see it's significant. And what I talked yesterday about with some of you, you can also combine them. And this we call here a BIS score, meaning that we try to account for the speed accuracy trade-offs. So if someone is very fast but is making more errors, then they should be penalized for this. And if you calculate these indexes, then you see the group differences as well. And what we see from this, we see that BPDs were worse in inhibiting their automatic imitation tendencies, especially when accounting for errors. And because the p-scores are calculated slightly differently, these are negative values, but overall you see that BPD in green is worse than healthy controls. So with this results, we showed that BPD are making more errors, that maybe the task is a bit demanding, but overall we could replicate what we know from previous studies. And it could be that the BPD group has less agency over their actions, and they are prone to this interference from the others, which I talked before could be termed as isocentric bias. So this was the first task. Now we are going to the visual perspective taking task. And again, you see the distributions here. We see a slightly difference between units, so I will definitely investigate this as well. And what we also see here, first of all, we see here are the congruent, incongruent conditions. And we see that in the incongruent condition, BPD in healthy controls made the same number of errors. So this incongruence didn't really affect them. Surprisingly, what we see is that BPD made more errors in the congruent conditions when what they and the avatar saw is the same. So it's quite impressive because usually you would expect other results in another direction. And this is a bit a complicated graph. I will definitely make it easier for you in a second. But what you see here is the two perspectives, self-other, self-other. You see BPD here and healthy controls over there. And in darker color, these are the congruent trials, so the easier ones. And in the light color are the incongruent trials, and more complicated ones. And what you see here, if we talk about the egocentric bias, we see that both groups, healthy control and BPD, were worse in the incongruent trial, and there was no group differences in egocentric tendencies. So the way of self-projection was to a similar extent in both groups. Now let's turn to the isocentric tendencies. And what you will see here, that healthy controls are reversed in the incongruent trials, which we know from the literature and it's systematic listening. But what we don't see in BPD, we don't see this difference in the BPD group. So it means that even in this congruent trial, they reverse. So in this trial, they would need to evaluate or to verify how many dots they see, and still they are biased by what another person is seeing, even though they're seeing the same number of dots. So the condition, which is supposed to be one of the easiest one, is not that easy for BPD, and so there are anthrocentric intrusions when thinking about the self. Also, when calculating the indexes, the differences between incongruent and congruent trials, we see no group differences in reaction times or errors, but what we see when we combined it, we see significant results. Of course, you can say it's only 0.05, but still it shows here that it's important to account for errors and also to penalize too fast but error-prone reaction times. And you can see here that the difference for BPD is small. It's just because they are not good in both conditions. Also, you would ask, what about their overall reaction times and errors? So as I told at the beginning, we also used a very simple Stroop task, and we don't see here group differences, meaning that in the task which is demanding but not social, again back to yesterday, what is social, what is not social, but let's say it's a not social task, then we don't have here any group differences. So to summarize this, this task has been used for the first time in a large sample, and we find anthrocentric tendencies, especially due to the fact that they are not so good in the self-congruent trials. We also need another control condition. So here we need at least a condition where there is no social agent. And I know that Alex and Henrik are already thinking about this. And our next step is, of course, to finalize the data collection and to look into the role of covariates and, of course, talk about diagnosis from a dimensional perspective. So not just having a diagnosis or not, but rather a dimensional approach from low impairment to extensive impairment. So this was the second part. Now I move into the survey. And the idea was that you know from your experience that many of the tasks have been criticized because there are problems of how we measure, how we are using reaction time paradigms, and it's always good to complement it with the survey, with other like multi-methods approach. And what we are currently, our problem of our team is that there is no self-as distinction questionnaire which would align with the measures we are using in the laboratory, so this egocentric, anthrocentric biases. And therefore we thought, okay, if there is no questionnaire, then we will be working on it. And what we want to measure self-as distinction on a continuum from the normal functioning to a clinical, so that it can be also used in a clinical setting. This is how this questionnaire looks like. It has 4 quadrants, and you know already the biases. So there is an anthrocentric and egocentric bias, but also emotional and cognitive intrusions. So this time we don't measure motor self-as distinction, but rather we here include emotions as well, because it's quite relevant for the BPD. And it has not only these 2 domains, cognitive, affective, egocentric, anthrocentric, but also self-as awareness, how to handle different, which perspective is silent at the time. And we also want to have an overall measure of self-as distinction, so kind of a component in a hierarchical sense, which stands above. And I just give you some of the examples. So for example, as you see, cognitive anthrocentric bias is when I'm influenced by the others. And even if someone harshly criticizes a person, I can still form my own opinion about that person. So I can protect myself from the intrusions coming from the others and build my own opinion. A clinical item would be when meeting someone new, I tend to immediately think like they do. So I cannot protect myself from these intrusions. I adopt them and I merge them with mine. In the affective domain, it's quite similar. I can easily keep up my mood, even when people around me are in a bad mood, or I cannot help but feel completely devastated when hearing about people suffering. So it means here it's about emotions, and I can protect myself from this all distress which is happening in the world. Another tool I'm measuring the egocentric bias is when I project my own states onto others. So, for example, when necessary, I can easily put my own opinion aside. So it's a good self-as distinction. I can forget about my own self and amplify the perspective of another person. Or I can't imagine anyone having a different opinion from mine. This would be, again, a clinical item. And even when I'm sad, I can easily focus on how other people are feeling. And then I feel rejected by someone. I feel like everyone is rejecting me, even though they can say otherwise. So you kind of ignore everything. You just project your own state onto others. And we already ran a first validation round in the French sample, and overall, just in a short summary, a good internal coherence and atoms are not that difficult. That there is a convergent validity with the empathy questionnaire and also with the old self-other differentiation scale. There was one scale, but as I said, we need more variation in the items. It has a good predictive value of LPFC and social functioning. And there are gender differences as expected, and also confirmatory analysis showed an excellent fit. But of course, it's just for one language, which is a great starting point. But our next step are to shorten the scale. Now we have too many items. And of course, for the clinical utility, we would need to have 5 or 7 items per scale to make it manageable. We also want to translate into other languages, such as, for example, German, English, Dutch, Czech, and many others. And what we also need, we need to create an ecological and momentary assessment items, which would help us to measure self-other distinction in a real-life way. Because as you can imagine that self-report questionnaires are also prone to bias, especially in the clinical population. Many of them cannot really estimate their own self-functioning. So these are the next steps. And if you're interested in this project, if you're interested in collaboration, please send us a message. We have a web page and all the information you can find there. We are happy to connect. And now I'm moving to my last point here. This is the victim science mindset. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but there are many victim science initiatives. So on the picture there are many dogs, many babies, many goats, many primates, ecological science accelerator. There is also many. So there are many victim science initiatives. What we need one for the clinical domain, because it would help to address the replication crisis. It would also help to make our sample more diverse. But what is important here, that the victim science is a mindset that through collaborative effort, through supporting each other, through sharing resources, we can answer complex questions. And it's not really about just collecting the data, so not becoming a super M-Turk, like my friend says. It's rather being in this mindset that if we can distribute the task, if every one of us can do their part, then we can really tackle complex questions. And it is not easy. Coordination and management can take lots of time, but it's worth it. And of course, it's a fallacy to consider that the size alone matters. It's rather about the approach and not making it too large or playing with numbers. And we should not also forget about the survival bias, that there are many victim science initiatives which are well known, but we don't know anything about those victim science projects that died and never ended in an outcome. So if you're interested, we just published a preprint on lessons learned from victim science, and I would recommend, if you're interested, to read it or connect with me and we can discuss it as well. And what we learned from our collaboration is that, of course, it's hard. First of all, even though all countries which are participating, they're all weird, from a weird part of the world, Western, educated, rich, industrialized, democratic, and we still had troubles to standardize the diagnosis. So still different clinical units diagnose BPD in slightly different ways. So we need to find out how to make it, whether we can say that we have patients with the same diagnosis or not. We, of course, need to translate many of the instruments which are not available, or there are not so many validated translations. Ethics is a very, very complicated issue. I would say in Belgium it was the hardest one to get an ethical approval. I don't know. In Czech Republic it was like, so yeah, thank you. Then data collection, so we need to give a balance between making it as standardized as possible, so we can say that everyone collected the data the way we wanted them to collect it, but in another way we have to also allow them to deviate a bit, because not every unit can follow this strict procedure. And of course, the team dedication, so what helps that everyone in our project is involved in conceptualization and also in thinking and theory-driven approach. So it helps a lot when experts want to share their experience as well. And what is the outlook? One of the questions could be whether the structural psychopathology is universal, so we can think about it as well, or whether it is too weird focused, and we try to bring this idea onto others countries and cultures. And there is a conference which happens every year in an online format, so if you're interested, it goes, as you can see, a victim science conference. I really can recommend it. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and especially for everyone involved in this project, Henrik, Pavla, Alex, Celine, and many others. And thank you so much for your attention.